Today I'd like to cover the history of RC crawling. Now, I've covered this before, but today is Santa talking about it. And maybe my memory isn't as good as it was in the past, or maybe my memory has changed. So if you want to go back and look at some of the earlier videos and then tell me that I'm wrong in this video, you feel free to do that, because none of us are infallible. So I had a question about how RC crawlers became a thing. And I thought it was a really good question, and although I have covered it before, my impressions of how things started today may be different than the last time we talked about this 5 or 10 years ago, even by now, I guess. So let's talk about it. And I would like y'all to put your impressions down below, because I know a lot of y'all are actually pretty long time crawlers. Maybe you've been in it since the early days when you couldn't even buy one. You wanted to build a crawler, it was uphill both ways. So let's talk about it. What I feel was the first real crawler on the market was the Tamiya Bruiser. And although a lot of people didn't build crawlers out of them, they were an extremely scale rig. They kind of broke easy on the first ones from my understanding, but it was still a scale truck, and it was really one of the only ones on the market for such a long time. And people did build scale crawlers out of them, but it wasn't really a thing because they broke so easily if you took them into hard objects. This is at least my understanding. I never personally had a bruiser. I had a few friends at the hobby shop that had bruisers, and when the TLT came out, they essentially swapped those TLT axles on like with a quickness, because the bruiser axles at the time, not only could you not get parts for them, but they were really easy to break, evidently. So that's my understanding of the really early days of crawling. Was it was essentially a bruiser, and you kind of get what you get, and you don't try to thrash them too hard sort of situation. Y'all may understand this a little bit differently. The next rig that people were building into crawlers, from my recollection, at the time when I got into crawling, it's like 2002 area, it was clodbusters. People were repurposing clodbusters, and we had all those old racing chassis, and some people would repurpose them and kind of redo your linkages and everything to be better at crawlers. But a lot of people started making their own chassis, and Mud Cow. That's really the videos that I watched off of YouTube, and you can search Mud Cow RC and maybe come up with a few of them. The original channel, I think, I don't know, got taken down or whatever from inactivity, or something happened, but they've been re-uploaded on there. And it's just a dude that built essentially a custom body, or a custom chassis. I think he was using the, let's see, I know I've got one around here. Yeah, it don't matter. He was using like Proline bodies and HPI bodies and stuff like that. And he was throwing them on a custom chassis that was built more for crawling. But at the time, you really, like, you had to custom build these yourselves. The four links you had to make yourself. The chassis you had to make yourself. You had to do your body mounts. There was still, from the racing days, there was still a lot of stuff for mounting your servo and giving you link mounts and stuff like that. But that was really how we had to start out when I started crawling, is you had to build a clodbuster. And you had to essentially buy the clodbuster kit and then throw almost everything out. And you'll notice a repeating pattern with this. So my first one that I built was actually a clodbuster, and the chassis, I've still got it around here somewhere, was just me with a hacksaw. I ended up buying a scroll saw as well for this. And I just cut out some trapezoid plates, did some like angle aluminum on the sides, drilled it all out in place so that it would bolt together, being extremely asymmetrical. And it worked pretty good. But we couldn't just buy good tires for crawling at the time, so we really had to cut and sipe and sand the sidewalls, and do where you chop the wheel itself to make it narrower, and that would kind of like pinch your carcass and give you more traction for crawling. Not good for racing because it would kind of like roll back and forth on the treads, but better for crawling, of course. So a lot of work, a whole lot of work. We would buy the axles, we'd throw out almost everything, buy internals from ThunderTech or whoever at the time, build your own chassis, etc., etc. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of work. My first chassis that I built, I probably had 40 hours of hand work just building that thing, because there was a lot of hacksaw and making the links by hand from arrow shaft, stuff like that. Fast forward a few years, maybe, maybe I forget when the TLT came out. Maybe it's 2003, 2004. The TLT Rockbuster came out. I should have brought the kit. I still have a few new unboxed kits. I don't believe that I have anything that's put together here. I don't think I even have any axles here. Let me look. Yeah, I don't. The old stuff I don't really keep around handy. But at any rate, the TLT Rockbuster kit came out. And these were axles that Tamiya had repurposed from a semi truck and put them into this 12 scale, whatever they called it, kit. It had a belt drive transmission in the middle that I believe was open diff in the middle as well at first, if I remember correctly, because it had ball bearings and 2 slipper plates. And as the original kit, it was not a rock crawler by any means, nowhere near a stretch of a rock crawler. But the axles, this is the reoccurring theme that we have here. The axles were really good to steel, and then the shafts weren't bad, but there were companies, RCP crawlers in particular, that made a lot of aftermarket for those axles. We would keep the center gears, replace the outer shafts, end up lopping the plastic ears off of the axles, throwing on essentially press braked, or whatever you want to call them, bent metal ears for that, do like machined outers. Again, I mean, we were almost using nothing but the plastic housings and then the center diff from the kit, and then everything else got thrown out. And so we're right back to making your own chassis. We had to make our own servo mounts for the axles. We had to make our own links still. You had to mishmash them all together. We were still stealing transmissions from Stampedes at the time. So I was getting on eBay and buying Stampede transmissions before it really caught on. And you could get them for like 15, 20 bucks a piece. Once crawlers started to really catch on and the Stampede transmission, it held on for years until it was essentially usurped by the AX10. They went up to like 50 bucks a pop because we were competing with each other for these parts. I bought a Stampede used just so I could steal a transmission off of it in the early days. But then we started getting chassis like the SPV, SPV2, SPV3. SPV2, you would bolt in your Stampede transmission like through the side, through the mounting ears for your A-arms. Actually became the center transmission mount instead. Again, we're mostly hacking a lot of parts together. You can't buy one at all. 2007. Axial comes out with a set of axles and a center transmission, and that's all that it was. But they saw how many people were taking the TLT kits, the Rockbusters, and they were stealing the axles and then taking transmissions from Stampedes, and they said, hey, why don't we offer axles and transmissions for these people? So all these chassis kit makers, they adapted pretty quick. They put holes in the skid plate so that you could bolt up both the AX transmission, I think it was called AX, maybe AX10, y'all can correct me in the comments, and you can still use your Stampede transmission, and then you could also use this axial transmission. And the axles themselves, they were worlds above the TLT axles. If I remember correctly, we not only got more gear down, but then we started getting aftermarket options of better steering angles. You get hardened shafts. It was just a better platform to start with. It had better center clearance by a little bit, not a lot, and generally had a better width, and that way you didn't have so much scrub, because with the AX10 you had to do like extenders and the width of the axle versus what you wanted to build your width of vehicle. You ended up getting a whole lot of scrub steer just because your tires were sticking way out from where the pivot point of your knuckles were. It was a vast improvement, and so the market really, really quickly went from those TLT axles to the AX10 axles. Now again, you're buying all of these parts separate. Your chassis, you either had to make or buy. The links, even today, it's really hard to find a good link maker that can make something for your build. I know there's some out there, but we were still, for the most part, either having somebody custom build our links, or we were having to build them ourselves out of like arrow shafts. That was still really popular back in the day. And then we got into threaded with brake line over it. Get some all thread, throw some brake line over it. There's all sorts of different ways. So it was like this one step at a time, right? And in 2007, you still couldn't buy a crawler. Now, keep in mind, I incorporated HolmesHobbies in 2005. So we're already 2 years into it, and you still can't buy a crawler, but people are making them. It's really popular. There's a lot of people that love to build. 2008 rolls around, and the AX10 comes out. AX10, what do they call it? There was some other name, maybe y'all can help me out. But the AX10 came out as a ready to run, or at least a kit at first, and then a ready to run later. And although this was an improvement, the chassis still wasn't great, to tell you the truth. Like the roll center wasn't great, the torque twist, like you pull and hold one out, or if you get like is it a Gen 7? A Red Cat Gen 7, I think, has more or less the same link geometry and everything, and the roll center's way too high. We got a lot of torque twists. It wasn't great, but at the time it was the best. And then you could get an aftermarket chassis for those that would bolt up and make your geometry even better. So we had a lot of little cottage industry guys pop up. T1E, let's see if I can remember. Deluxe Fab, of course, was making chassis pretty early in the day, but we had T1E, we had, what was that other company? There were these two chassis makers, and everybody like butted heads. We had Y-Town. Please help me in the comments of these early chassis makers. They also tended to make plate wheels, carbon fiber wheels as well. And this was really the start of when we started to invest in really good geometry and starting to really get to know things, aftermarket axle casings, aluminum housing, stuff like that. It started to kind of gain traction, right? Not a pun in that way. We started getting tires made that were better for crawlers, because when the AX10 came out, that lizard compound stunk so much. Like you'd open up the box and it would reek up the house for days and days. And it was terrible for traction on top of all of this. So we still had to do cut and shuts and like sand our tires down and throw out those stuck tires. And this was the same thing over and over and over as far as the competition scene. Even today, the competition scene is still to where you will take a rig, like the closest that I've got is the VRD. Where'd I put it? It's hiding somewhere. VRD. We've got the VRD Carbon from Vanquish, and it has really good geometry. But the majority of people that are going to compete are going to toss out this chassis, and they're going to put an aftermarket one on there. And we're going to probably do an aftermarket housing on the front. We're going to do aftermarket knuckles. It still is really heavy aftermarket driven for the competition scene. But 2008 is when we started to get vehicles. And then the SCX10 came out, which was a more scale version. It had even better geometry than the AX10. If you chopped the rails down and threw a body on it, it actually was a better competition crawler than the AX10 was. But again, all these aftermarket chassis makers, they gave us options that had better geometry for competition. And really, that's what drove the scene for a really long time, was these aftermarket people that were pushing the envelope of what the crawlers can do. And all of that information and all of that work has filtered into what we can buy today, what we have behind us. In my opinion, one of the flagship releases that really changed the direction of the industry was the TRX4. And I'd have to look back and see how many years ago it is now. It's 6 or something. The time starts to fly. That is when I feel like a lot of people took it seriously as an industry. When Traxxas stepped into it, suddenly everybody else was like, well, if Traxxas is into it, then it must be a real portion of the industry. And it was somewhere around 10 years ago, crawling actually took over. I'd have to look back again, but around 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, crawling took over the RC segment, being more than 50% of all the volume. And this is including bashers, this is including racers, this is including boats and airplanes. Crawling, scale rigs took over. And I'm not sure if they're still the majority of the industry or not, because everything ebbs and flows, of course. But when Traxxas stepped into the market, that's when people took notice. And we started getting, we've got hundreds of releases in every single year at this point, because there's factories upon factories upon factories that are all making their stuff. People rebranding, there's so much out there now. It's a really fleshed out industry, and the aftermarket scene is absolutely insane for all of these rigs pretty much. So that's when we tipped over. It's when Traxxas got into it, and then Axial really upped their game on releases. We had Element start to come out with stuff which is a subsidiary of AE, Associated Electronics. We, of course, now Vanquish is putting out their own ready-to-run rigs because they were making aftermarket, mostly for Axial for a really long time. And then when Traxxas got into it, they kept away from the Traxxas aftermarket. It's not a performance-minded vehicle in a lot of ways. It does have great geometry, but the axles themselves aren't performance-minded. So I can understand why they didn't get into that, because they've always been performance-minded. And they ended up just coming out with their own rigs instead of trying to compete with that. And at this point, yes, they do make aftermarket that will work with Axial, but they started focusing on their own. They started doing their own axle sizes. Like, it's come so long so far in really kind of a quick period of time. But from the lowly Bruiser to the Clodbuster to the TLT, and then Axial really pushed the envelope at first, got us going in a direction of, hey, these axles and transmissions and these ready-to-run rigs aren't half bad, at least. And then the big boys took notice. Then Traxxas took notice, and it's just kind of from there. So it's been a journey, to say the least. And I've been in it since before it was actually an industry, when you had to put your rig together uphill both ways, and half the time you put it together and it performed terribly. And so the people who were competing that were really good were the ones that were willing to put in hours and hours and hours driving the rig, either tuning and tweaking and driving and tuning and tweaking and driving, or to just literally know how their rig would perform. But a lot of it was tuning and tweaking and having a geometry that nobody else would have, because you either built it yourself or you're the guy that's running the company that's making aftermarket chassis. And I didn't get into that, actually. In the early days, I almost got myself a router so that I could make chassis and wheels, and I ended up just getting into motors almost by mistake, because the chassis guys were like, hey, you know, I can provide you with a chassis. And I was like, well, I can provide you with a motor. And we just kind of snowballed from there. So yeah, so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Maybe a little different than what you remember. So I'd love to have your input down below, maybe jog my memory about some companies that I've forgotten along the way. There've been so many that have come and gone in kind of the small segment portions, the custom chassis, the custom wheels. Who was that one? Aerotex. Any of y'all remember Aerotex? If you remember anything about them, tell me in the comments. They are no longer around either. And you know, going through the t-shirts on that video, you could tell how many used to be here and are no longer in the industry, which is sad. But at the same time, cottage industry with cottage industry folks that are usually doing this as a nighttime job out of the garage or whatever, not everybody was able to size up to a point to where they could get out of the garage. And you know, the industry moves along, and then all those good ideas from the small guys get taken by the big industry players because they're good ideas, and unless you have a patent on it or whatever, you can't defend it. And there's not been a lot of patents in this industry besides like the stick chassis. Totally forgot about the stick chassis. Oh yeah, I've got one hiding around here. I'll have to show it one day. So there you go. The history of RC crawling. It came from very humble roots, and now we've got choices upon choices upon choices, enough to where I can say, I don't like this scale of crawler. There you go. So, as always, thanks for tuning in. Have a great day. You've made it to the end of the video. Hopefully that means you liked what you saw. If you want to help out the channel, you can like, subscribe, and definitely comment down below. We would like to hear new ideas from you, so be sure you let us know what you'd like to see. There are some other suggestions probably floating by my head right now that you can check out. And otherwise, we appreciate your support and your help growing the channel.